Year 1609, the port of Valencia, Spain. Thousands of people are being pushed toward the ships, carrying only what they can hold in their hands. Weren't they Spanish? They spoke Spanish. Their clothes were not very different either. In fact, they had lived here for almost 1,000 years, but it did not matter, because these people had one crime. Their ancestors were Muslims, or their ancestors had reverted to Islam. People called them Moriscos, which means little more. They had been forced to be baptized and forced to go to church, but inside their homes, they still secretly prayed Salah. How did they know who was secretly Muslim? The methods were simple. If a woman went to the river several times a day to wash, it meant she was making wudu. She was marked as suspicious. If a gardener washed his arms while working, he became a suspect. If a clean kafan was found inside someone's house, that person was taken away to be tortured. The eyes of the Inquisition were everywhere. And now, after 100 years of torture, King Philip III of Spain made one decision. All of them would be expelled. The official order was written with kind words. They will not be mistreated. Their belongings will not be taken, but the reality was very different. The road to San Mateo in Valencia became filled with the bodies of murdered Moriscos. Some ship captains threw their passengers into the sea after taking their money. Those who reached North Africa were driven away because people said they were bringing disease. Many also became targets of bandits. At least 3 million people, and according to some sources, more than 5 million. Families who had lived on this land for 9 centuries. In one night, with one decision, they were erased from history. For hundreds of years, Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, had enjoyed its golden age. The followers of 3 different religions lived together in peace. But after power changed hands a century earlier, that golden age fell into darkness. But why? How was the community that built Spain's greatest age destroyed with such cruelty? The answer begins 9 centuries earlier, with a small army at a narrow strait. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because if you do not understand the beginning of this story, you cannot understand its ending. In this video, you will discover the complete history of Al-Andalus and how it helped shape Europe. You are watching Religious Story TV. Subscribe to the channel for more videos about Islamic history. Please like this video and leave a comment to help us reach more people. If you are ready, let's begin. Year 711, the Strait of Gibraltar, a narrow strip of water. On the other side stood a great kingdom, Visigothic Spain. On this side was a small army, about 7,000 men. Its commander was Tariq ibn Ziyad. According to tradition, after his soldiers landed, Tariq gave a shocking order: burn the ships. Think about that for a moment. He was destroying his own way back. It was a great sacrifice. Now there was only one choice: move forward or die. But how could such a small army defeat a powerful kingdom? The answer was hidden inside Spain itself. King Roderick of the Visigoths had taken the throne by force. Many powerful families hated him. Some historians say that one of Roderick's rivals, a border governor named Count Julian, secretly worked with the Muslims and even helped them cross into Spain. Allah creates the means, as long as there are people with faith. What seems impossible can suddenly become possible. After the Muslim army crossed the strait, the Great Battle of Guadalete began. It lasted 7 days. Roderick's army was much larger, but in the middle of the battle, something unexpected happened. Some of the king's own troops changed sides or simply left the battlefield. Roderick was defeated. His body was never found. After this victory, Tariq ibn Ziyad did not stop. He marched north. One by one, the cities surrendered, many of them with almost no resistance. For many people in Spain, this did not look like an invasion. It looked like freedom from a harsh king. Within just a few years, almost the entire Iberian Peninsula came under Muslim rule. A small army had brought down a great kingdom, but this was only the beginning. Winning the land was the easy part. The real challenge was ruling it and building a civilization that would last. And one of the most dramatic moments in this story had not yet happened. A young prince would escape alone, cross the sea, and find refuge in these lands. His story would shape the future of Al-Andalus, because the state he built would not be just another conquered kingdom. It would become a civilization built on survival, hope, and rebirth. Year 750, a riverbank outside Damascus. The male members of the Umayyad family had been invited to a peace meeting. The Abbasids welcomed them with food and kind words. Then the swords came out. It was one of the most important moments in Islamic history. Almost the entire Umayyad family was killed that day. Hatred toward the Umayyads had been growing for a long time, and the Abbasids wanted complete control. But one word is important: almost, because one man escaped. His name was Abd al-Rahman. He was only 20 years old. As soon as he learned that his family had been killed, he fled into the night with his younger brother. Abbasid agents were hunting him everywhere. From Palestine to Egypt and then across North Africa, he spent years on the run. At one point, his younger brother was captured and killed. Abd al-Rahman was left almost completely alone. So where could he go? The answer came from his mother's side. His mother was a Berber woman, and her family had strong ties with the Berber tribes of North Africa. Using those connections, Abd al-Rahman gathered loyal supporters. Then he turned his eyes toward the other side of the Mediterranean, Al-Andalus. In 755, he crossed into Spain with a small force. Many former Umayyad governors and soldiers there still remained loyal to his family. They joined him. In 756, near Cordoba, he defeated the Abbasid governor and captured the city. At only 25 years old, a prince whose entire family had been murdered, who had spent years running for his life, was now the ruler of his own state. But notice something. He did not call himself Caliph. He chose the title Emir, staying cautious about the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. Historians later gave him a famous nickname, the Falcon of Quraysh. Like a falcon, he survived alone, relying only on his own strength, and rose again. The state, founded by Abd al-Rahman, would become the foundation of Al-Andalus for the next 2 centuries. But first, he had to deal with rebellions from within. Think about it. A young man loses almost his entire family. He spends years running for his life. Then, thousands of kilometers away, he builds a brand new state from nothing. This was not just a political success. It was one of history's greatest stories of survival. Even today, many historians consider his story one of the most remarkable examples of rebuilding a life from nothing. Just think about it. Most people his age, after such a tragedy, would have given up. He never did. When Abd al-Rahman I died in 788, he did not leave behind a perfect country. The rebellions had not completely ended. The Christian kingdoms in the north still remained, but Al-Andalus now had a capital, a stable government, and a dynasty that would continue. The young refugee prince, once hunted with a price on his head, had laid the foundation of a state that would last for centuries in Europe. Even so, the true rise of Cordoba had not yet begun. One day it would compete with Baghdad and Constantinople. It would become one of the most famous cities in the world. But first, Al-Andalus needed another great ruler. In 912, a 21-year-old ruler came to the throne. His name was Abd al-Rahman III, but the country he inherited was no longer the strong state his ancestors had built. Many cities outside Cordoba ruled themselves. Rebellions had broken out. The largest was led by Ibn Hafsun in the south. At the same time, the Christian kingdoms in the north took advantage of the fighting and attacked the border regions. Al-Andalus was once again close to breaking apart. The young ruler had two choices. He could defend only Cordoba and watch his country slowly fall apart, or he could fight to unite Al-Andalus again. He chose the second path. Soon after becoming ruler, he marched out with his army. Some cities joined him through agreements. Others resisted and were defeated. Year after year, city by city, fortress by fortress, he rebuilt the country. This was not a campaign of a few months. It took nearly 20 years. One of the greatest challenges was the fortress of Bobastro, controlled by the family of Ibn Hafsun. Hidden in the mountains, it was one of the strongest strongholds in Al-Andalus. But Abd al-Rahman III never gave up. He cut off its supply routes. He took control of the surrounding towns. Slowly, the fortress became isolated. In 928, Bobastro finally fell. There was no longer any major force in Al-Andalus that could openly challenge his rule. 1 year later, in 929, he took an even greater step. He declared himself Caliph. Al-Andalus was no longer just an independent emirate. It had become a caliphate, claiming its own political and religious authority alongside the Abbasids in Baghdad and the Fatimids in North Africa. This title was not just for honor. Abd al-Rahman III wanted the world to know that Al-Andalus was no longer a distant corner of the Islamic world. Cordoba would stand beside Baghdad and Cairo as one of its greatest capitals. During his rule, Cordoba grew rapidly. Gold and ivory arrived from North Africa, spices and fine fabrics came from the east, trade goods arrived from northern Europe, skilled craftsmen produced leather, textiles, metalwork and pottery. The wealth from agriculture helped build new neighborhoods and magnificent buildings. Roads were repaired, bridges and water canals were restored. Gardens, fountains and courtyards became part of everyday life. Many writers of the time praised Cordoba for its wide streets, clean roads, and main avenues lit at night. The exact population is still debated, but historians agree on one thing. In the 10th century, Cordoba was one of the largest and most vibrant cities in Western Europe. Abd al-Rahman III wanted to show his power in more than war. Just outside Cordoba, he built a magnificent palace city called Madinat al-Zahra. It was not only a royal palace, it was a new center of government with offices, gardens, reception halls, mosques, baths and military buildings. Foreign ambassadors were welcomed there. Visitors from Christian kingdoms, the Byzantine Empire and North Africa came to see the wealth and power of Al-Andalus with their own eyes. When Abd al-Rahman III died in 961, he left behind a country completely different from the one he had inherited. Al-Andalus had been reunited. Cordoba had become rich and powerful. The Caliphate had become one of the greatest powers in Western Europe. But the Golden Age was not remembered only for its palaces or its armies. What truly made it unforgettable was its love of books, knowledge and learning. After Abd al-Rahman III, his son Al-Hakam II would turn his father's powerful state into one of the greatest centers of learning in the world. When his son, Al-Hakam II, became caliph in 961, he wanted to combine power with knowledge. The new caliph loved books more than war. He collected not only Islamic religious books, but also works on history, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Whenever a new book was written in Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, or another great city, the court of Cordoba often learned about it. Officials bought the books, scribes copied them. Then they were brought to Al-Andalus. Over time, Cordoba built one of the greatest royal libraries in the world. According to historical sources, it contained hundreds of thousands of books. These were not expensive books, kept only for display. Translators, scribes, bookbinders and scholars worked every day. Books from the East were copied, explained and prepared for students. The spread of paper also made knowledge easier to produce and share. While books were still rare and very expensive in much of Europe, the book trade was growing in Al-Andalus. Bookshops could be found in Cordoba, and professional scribes earned a living by copying books by hand. Owning books was no longer a privilege only for rulers and religious leaders. Wealthy merchants, government officials, and educated families also built private libraries. The number of books in a person's home became a sign of education and social status. Because books and paper were easy to find in Cordoba, knowledge reached many more people. This was not only a place where old knowledge was preserved, new discoveries were also being made. Doctors carefully observed diseases. They studied earlier medical books and recorded their own experience. They wrote about medicinal plants, medicines, and the treatment of wounds. One of the greatest scholars of this period was Abu al-Qasim al-Zahrawi. Living near Cordoba, he worked as a physician for many years. He not only treated patients, but also recorded his methods and medical cases in a great medical encyclopedia. He became especially famous for his work in surgery. He described how to set broken bones, close wounds, treat dental problems, and help during difficult childbirth. He even included drawings of many surgical instruments. His books showed not only what doctors should do, but also which tools they should use and how to use them. Centuries later, his works were translated into Latin and became standard medical textbooks across Europe. Astronomy in Al-Andalus was about much more than watching the stars. Scholars calculated the movements of the planets, improved calendars, and developed better instruments for navigation. Mathematics was used in trade, inheritance, architecture, and land surveying. Experts in agriculture studied different soils, irrigation methods, and the best climates for growing crops. New canals and water wheels helped increase food production and allowed farmers to grow a wider variety of crops. But what made the world of learning in Al-Andalus truly special was not only its Muslim scholars. Jewish and Christian doctors, translators, and government officials were also part of this intellectual life. A scholar could study under a teacher from another faith. Doctors from different religions could work together in the same palace. Arabic became the common language of science. This did not mean that Al-Andalus was a perfect society where everyone was equal. But people from different communities lived in the same cities, allowing ideas and knowledge to move freely between them. The greatest treasure of Cordoba was not its marble palaces or its gold. Its greatest treasure was a culture that encouraged people to ask questions, seek knowledge, and keep learning. And at the heart of that world, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived and worked side by side. Al-Andalus was a Muslim state. Muslims were at the center of the government, the army, and the legal system. Christians and Jews were allowed to keep their religion, continue their worship, and manage many of their own community affairs. In return, they paid a special tax called jizya. This status gave them protection. Building new churches and synagogues sometimes required official permission. Even so, Al-Andalus offered far greater religious rights than most of Europe at that time. In many ways, even modern Europe did not grant such broad rights to religious minorities until much later. The streets of Cordoba showed this diversity every day. Muslim merchants, Christian craftsmen, and Jewish doctors worked in the same markets. Arabic became the common language for much of the population. Over time, many Christians began speaking Arabic, wearing Arabic clothing, and enjoying the music of Al-Andalus. These Christians became known as Mozarabs. They remained Christian, but were deeply influenced by Arabic culture. Some Christian priests even complained that young people preferred Arabic poetry and literature over Latin religious books. Because Arabic was not only the language of government, it was also the language of science, trade, and higher learning. Al-Andalus also gave new opportunities to Jewish communities. Under the Visigoths, many Jews had faced severe persecution. Under Muslim rule, they were able to rebuild their synagogues and community institutions. Many became merchants, doctors, translators, and government officials. Some even became trusted advisors to the rulers. One of the best-known examples was Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who lived during the reign of Abd al-Rahman III. He was a Jewish doctor and scholar. He served as the caliph's personal physician and also carried out important diplomatic missions. A Jewish scholar holding such an important position in the court of a Muslim ruler was very unusual in much of Europe at that time. People of different religions did not simply live in the same cities. They worked together. Muslim scholars studied with Jewish teachers. Christian translators worked with Arabic books. Jewish doctors treated Muslim patients. They shared the same markets, baths, and neighborhoods. However, this peaceful life was not always free from conflict. At times of political crisis, some Christian groups rebelled against Muslim rule. Because of these conflicts, some Muslim rulers introduced new restrictions on minority communities. In later centuries, especially under stricter governments, the open and tolerant atmosphere of earlier Al-Andalus gradually became more limited. Some rebels and groups connected to them were forced to leave their cities. Even with these difficult periods, people of different faiths helped build the same civilization for centuries. The medicine, music, poetry, and science of Al-Andalus were not the achievement of one people alone. They were the shared work of people who learned from one another, and this knowledge would not remain in Al-Andalus. Christian students and translators from the north would later translate many of these works into Latin, helping spread the knowledge of Al-Andalus across the rest of Europe. By the year 981, Al-Andalus was entering a difficult period. When Al-Hakam II died, his son Hisham II became caliph, but he was only 11 years old. An 11-year-old boy could not rule a great caliphate. And in that moment of weakness, one of the most controversial men in the history of Al-Andalus rose to power. His name was Muhammad ibn Abi Amir. History would remember him by another name, Al-Mansur, the Victorious. He had started as a court secretary, but he quickly became the real ruler of the state. He kept the young caliph inside the palace while he ruled as Hajib, the chief minister. The caliph still sat on the throne, but the real power belonged to Al-Mansur. And do you know how he showed his power? Through war. For nearly 20 years, he led more than 50 military campaigns against the Christian kingdoms in the north. More than 50 campaigns. That meant almost one major campaign every year. One of his most famous victories came in 997, when he captured Santiago de Compostela, one of the holiest pilgrimage sites in the Christian world. His army included Muslim Arabs, Berbers, and, surprisingly, even some Christian mercenaries. For Al-Mansur, loyalty mattered more than background. But behind these great military victories, a dangerous problem was growing. The caliphate itself was becoming weaker. The caliph remained only a symbol. Real power was now in the hands of one man, and history teaches us a harsh lesson. When an entire system depends on one person, everything can collapse when that person is gone. Al-Mansur died in 1002. Soon after, a disaster began that almost no one expected. His legacy was a strange contradiction. He had never lost a major campaign, but he left behind a state that could no longer stand on its own. Power had become so centered around one man that, when he died, there was nothing strong enough to hold the system together. After his death, his sons tried to take his place, but they did not have their father's ability. The state began to fall apart like a house of cards. From 1009 to 1031, Al-Andalus entered a period known as the Fitna, a time of chaos, civil war, and struggle for power. Different men claimed to be caliph. Berber soldiers rebelled. Cordoba was attacked and looted again and again. Think about it, the city that had once been one of the greatest cities in Europe, the city whose libraries held more books than much of France and Germany combined, was now filled with blood and civil war. In 1031, the caliphate was officially abolished. After nearly 3 centuries, the Caliphate of Cordoba came to an end. So what happened next? Al-Andalus broke into many small kingdoms called Taifas: Seville, Granada, Zaragoza, Toledo. Each had its own ruler, its own army, and its own court. Surprisingly, this divided period was still rich in culture. The Taifa rulers competed to attract poets, scholars, and artists. Some historians even call it a period of many small golden ages. But militarily, it was a disaster. The great Caliphate was gone. In its place stood many small kingdoms that often fought one another. The Christian kingdoms in the north quickly saw this weakness. Some Taifa rulers even asked Christian kings to help them fight other Muslim kingdoms. Imagine that, a Muslim ruler making an alliance with a Christian army against another Muslim ruler. It was a sign of what was coming. In the north, a new power was slowly growing, and this time it would no longer stay on the defensive. A civilization once admired by the world was now watching itself fall apart from within. History teaches a painful lesson. No outside enemy can destroy a society as quickly as its own divisions. The caliphs of Cordoba had once commanded armies of hundreds of thousands. Now they could no longer even protect the gates of their own palace. The collapse came so quickly that people living in the same generation saw both the greatest heights and the deepest fall. Within a single lifetime, they watched paradise turn into chaos. Toledo, the old capital of the Visigothic kingdom, had been under Muslim rule for nearly 350 years. But in 1085, its gates opened to the army of King Alfonso VI of Castile and Leon. This was not just the fall of another city. It was the moment when history began to turn. The loss of Toledo shocked the divided Taifa kingdoms. If such an important city could fall so easily, who would be next? In fear, several Taifa rulers made a desperate decision. They asked for help from a powerful Muslim movement in North Africa, the Almoravids. They were a disciplined army from the Sahara Desert, united by a strict religious movement. Their leader, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, accepted the call. He crossed the sea. In 1086, at the Battle of Sagrajas, he defeated Alfonso's army in a crushing victory. But after saving Al-Andalus, Yusuf ibn Tashfin did not want to leave this important land in the hands of weak rulers who constantly fought each other. To restore order, he brought most of the Taifa kingdoms under his own rule and reunited Al-Andalus under one central government. At the same time, another famous figure was rising in the north. His name was El Cid. His real name was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar. He fought for both Christian and Muslim rulers before capturing Valencia and ruling it himself. His loyalty was not to Christianity or Islam. His loyalty was to his own power. He waited for the Almoravids to grow weaker. When he believed the time was right, he fought to expand his own rule. Meanwhile, Christian kingdoms in the north continued to grow stronger. Once again, the Muslims of Al-Andalus looked to North Africa for help. This time, a new power arrived, the Almohads. The Almohads followed an even stricter interpretation of Islam than the Almoravids. When they entered Al-Andalus, they fought not only against the Christian kingdoms, they also introduced stricter religious policies. Continuous attacks from the north and growing political instability made security a greater priority than before. As a result, some of the openness of earlier centuries became more limited. During this period, some Jewish and Christian communities, along with several well-known scholars, left Al-Andalus. At first, the Almohads were successful on the battlefield. In 1195, they won a major victory over Castile at the Battle of Alarcos. But in 1212, everything changed. For the first time in many years, the Christian kingdoms united. Castile, Aragon, Navarre, kingdoms that had often fought each other now stood together against one enemy. The Pope declared the campaign a crusade. Knights came from across Europe. The two armies met at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. This time, the Muslim army suffered a devastating defeat. It was not just another lost battle. It broke the military strength of Muslim Spain. The Almohad Empire never fully recovered. Why was this battle so important? Because the Christian kingdoms had discovered that they were stronger together than apart. That unity would change the future of the Iberian Peninsula. Within the next few decades, the greatest cities of Al-Andalus would begin to fall. After Las Navas de Tolosa, there was no turning back. The gates had been opened. The psychological impact of the battle was even greater than the military defeat itself. For centuries, the Christian kingdoms had struggled to unite. Now, they had found a common purpose. And once they were united, that alliance would not easily break apart. Even today, Las Navas de Tolosa is taught in Spain as one of the greatest turning points in its history. For Al-Andalus, it marked the beginning of a long and quiet collapse. The few commanders who escaped the battlefield returned south only to discover a painful truth. The strongest soldiers of Al-Andalus had been left behind on that hot summer battlefield. The 25 years after the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa became the fastest period of collapse in the history of Al-Andalus. The cities no longer fell one by one, they fell one after another. In 1236, Cordoba surrendered to King Ferdinand III of Castile. This was the city that had once been the capital of the Caliphate, the city with one of the greatest libraries in the world, the heart of Islamic civilization in Europe. Think for a moment about what its fall meant. 300 years earlier, it had been one of the brightest cities on earth. Now, its great mosque was turned into a cathedral. What happened to the people? Some stayed and lived under the new Christian rulers. Some moved south to the Muslim lands that still remained. Others crossed the sea and found refuge in North Africa. Then, in 1248, another great city was lost. Seville fell. Its fall was especially painful because the city had resisted for a long time. The siege lasted for months, but in the end, hunger and exhaustion won. The loss of Cordoba and Seville completely changed the map of Al-Andalus. The Muslim lands that had once covered most of the Iberian Peninsula were now reduced to a small area in the south. So what was left? Only one kingdom remained: Granada. But an important question remained. If the Christian kingdoms had become so powerful, why did they not conquer Granada immediately? The answer was simple. Granada found a way to survive. Its rulers paid tribute. They traded with the Christian kingdoms. Sometimes they even sent soldiers to help them. Granada was no longer an independent great power. It was a kingdom living on borrowed time. But that borrowed time lasted for almost 250 years, and during those years, Granada would build one of the most beautiful monuments in the world. The fall of Cordoba and Seville within only 12 years is still studied by historians today as an example of how quickly a great civilization can collapse. A civilization that had dominated the Iberian Peninsula for 3 centuries was reduced to a small corner of the south in only a few decades. Before surrendering Seville, some of its last defenders even considered destroying the city's great mosque and its famous minaret. In the end, they could not bring themselves to destroy something so beautiful. That minaret still stands today. It is known as La Giralda, one of the most famous landmarks of Seville. The rulers of the Kingdom of Granada knew one painful truth. They were the last. Every Muslim state before them had fallen. Cordoba was gone, Seville was gone, and one day Granada would fall too. What would it feel like to live with that knowledge? Some people would have given up. The Nasrid dynasty did the opposite. They built as if they could stop time. The Alhambra Palace was the result of that dream. Built on a red hill, it was filled with delicate carvings, peaceful gardens, and beautiful pools of water. It was designed to look like a piece of paradise on earth. One inscription on its wall says, "I am a garden adorned with beauty. Look at me, and you will understand." The rulers of Granada had a clever plan for survival. They paid regular tribute to Castile. They used the rivalries between Christian kingdoms to delay war. They became valuable trading partners, especially through the silk trade. For almost 250 years, from 1238 to 1492, this strategy worked. But if Castile was strong enough, why did it wait so long to conquer Granada? There were several reasons. The tribute brought money. A Muslim kingdom also gave Christian rulers a common enemy, helping them keep their own nobles united. And they often had other wars to fight, but everyone knew the truth. It was only a matter of time. Granada itself was also changing. Muslims fleeing from the north increased the city's population. The great intellectual life that had once made Cordoba famous across Europe was now only a memory. The great libraries were gone, but Granada was still rich. It was still beautiful. The Nasrid sultans knew that the end was coming, so they kept building beauty, almost as if they could hold back history itself. Even today you can feel it while walking through the Alhambra, in every carved wall, in every quiet garden, in every sound of flowing water. It feels like a civilization racing against time, trying to leave behind the most beautiful gift it could before disappearing. The Alhambra would one day become one of the most photographed monuments in the world, but the people who built it did so while watching their own kingdom slowly come to an end. Perhaps the most beautiful works of art are born this way, when people know the end is near, yet choose to spend their remaining time creating something beautiful for future generations. Even after the fall of Toledo, something remarkable happened. The city became home to what is now known as the School of Translators of Toledo. There, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked together to translate Arabic books into Latin. This is how the works of Aristotle and much of the knowledge of ancient Greece reached Europe. The knowledge that Muslim scholars had preserved and expanded helped plant the seeds of the European Renaissance. For the Jewish community, especially during the Golden Age of Al-Andalus, this was an extraordinary period. Some Jewish scholars rose to the highest positions in government, even becoming viziers. At that time, this was almost impossible in much of Christian Europe, where Jews often faced persecution and exile. And the greatest result of this shared society was not only tolerance, it was knowledge. In the next part, you will see how the great minds of Al-Andalus helped change the world. Perhaps this is what made Al-Andalus so special. It showed that differences could become a source of strength instead of conflict. Even today, people around the world still look for this kind of model. Think about one word: algorithm. Today, it is at the heart of every computer. The word comes from the name of a Muslim mathematician, Al-Khwarizmi. Even the word algebra comes from the Arabic al-Jabr, the title of one of his famous books. Al-Andalus inherited this scientific tradition and helped it grow. One of its greatest scholars was Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes. His commentaries on Aristotle changed the course of European philosophy. Imagine that. A Muslim philosopher would later become required reading at Christian universities across Europe. At the same time, another great thinker lived in Al-Andalus. Musa ibn Maimun, better known as Maimonides. He was a Jewish doctor and philosopher. When religious pressure increased in Al-Andalus, he was forced to leave, first for Morocco and later for Egypt. But his ideas had been shaped by the culture of Al-Andalus. His writings are still considered some of the most important works in Jewish philosophy. So how did all this knowledge reach Europe? The translation schools of Toledo played a key role, but there was another path: direct contact. European students traveled to the cities of Al-Andalus to study medicine, mathematics, and other sciences. Some learned Arabic, others spent years studying in its libraries. Architecture was also part of this legacy. The arches of the great mosque of Cordoba, the detailed carvings of the Alhambra, the advanced water systems. These were not only beautiful, they also showed some of the most advanced engineering of their time. Even today, this legacy lives on in many words we use. Alcohol, syrup, guitar, orange. All of these words have Arabic roots and spread to many languages through Spanish. Al-Andalus was not just a kingdom, it was a laboratory of ideas. And just as it reached its greatest achievements, its end was drawing near. Today, every student who studies algebra and every surgeon who uses modern surgical instruments still benefits from the work of the great minds of Al-Andalus, even if they do not know it. The writings of Ibn Rushd continued to be studied in places like Paris and Oxford for centuries after his death. The ideas of a philosopher from Al-Andalus helped shape the education of Europe's greatest universities. The year was 1482. Inside Granada, a crisis broke out that no one expected. A young prince, Abu Abd Allah Muhammad, better known in history as Boabdil, rebelled against his own father. Why? Palace intrigue, the struggle for power, a family divided. This conflict came at the worst possible time. In the north, a marriage had changed the future of Spain. Queen Isabella of Castile married King Ferdinand of Aragon. Together, they united the two most powerful Christian kingdoms. History would remember them as the Catholic monarchs. They had one goal: to finish the Reconquista, to bring all of Spain under Christian rule for the first time in almost 8 centuries. Granada's internal divisions gave them the perfect opportunity. A long war began. For 10 years, Ferdinand and Isabella slowly surrounded Granada. They cut off trade routes, they built strong siege camps, and they waited. Inside the city, hunger spread. Different groups turned against one another. Boabdil desperately tried to negotiate terms that would protect his people. Then came January 2nd, 1492. Granada surrendered. Boabdil rode out to meet Ferdinand and Isabella. He handed over the keys of the Alhambra. At first, the surrender seemed generous. Muslims would be allowed to keep their religion. They would not be forced to convert. Their property would be protected. Boabdil himself was given a small estate in the southern mountains where he could retire, but these promises would not last. Many Muslims believed that the new rulers would show the same justice they themselves had shown for centuries. Sadly, that belief would come at a terrible cost. According to tradition, as Boabdil left Granada for the last time, he stopped at a mountain pass. He turned around. He looked back at the beautiful city he had lost, and he began to cry. His mother, Aisha, is said to have told him, "Do not cry like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." That mountain pass is still known today as El Suspiro del Moro, the Moor's last sigh. But Boabdil did not know that the promises made to him would soon be broken. Even today, you can visit that mountain pass in Spain and see the same view. Perhaps this is one of history's greatest ironies. The end of an empire often begins not with one great battle, but with a family divided. Today, tourists visit El Suspiro del Moro without realizing that this quiet place witnessed the final chapter of an 800-year story. Before the ink on the surrender agreement was even dry, the first cracks began to appear. At first, it seemed that the promises would be kept. Muslims were still allowed to pray in their mosques. But every year, the pressure from the Catholic Church grew stronger. In 1499, a strict church leader named Cardinal Cisneros arrived in Granada. His approach was very different. He began a campaign of forced conversions. Thousands of Arabic manuscripts, books on science, poetry, medicine, philosophy, and religion were gathered in public squares and burned. The legacy of a civilization that had once owned some of the greatest libraries in the world was reduced to ashes. This pressure led to an inevitable reaction. Later that same year, a rebellion broke out in Granada, but it was crushed with great violence. The rebellion then gave the Catholic rulers what they wanted. They claimed they no longer had to keep the terms of the surrender agreement because the Muslims had rebelled. In 1502, a final decision was announced. There would be no Muslims left in Castile. People were given a simple choice: convert to Christianity or leave the country. But leaving was not easy. Travel permits were restricted. The ports were tightly controlled. For many people, leaving was not a real option. Hundreds of thousands were baptized by force. Whole villages were taken to churches and declared Christian. These people were given a new name, Moriscos. On paper, they were now Christians, but in their hearts, many remained Muslims. Behind closed doors, they secretly prayed Salah. During Ramadan, they secretly fasted. The authorities knew this, so they began watching them. Now our story is returning to where it began, to the port, to the final expulsion. But first, we must see how a century of surveillance became a machine of fear. The burning of the books became one of the most powerful symbols of this period. Because what made Al-Andalus truly great was not its swords, it was its libraries. And now, the ashes of those libraries were blowing through the streets. A civilization that had once possessed one of the greatest libraries in the world was now forced to watch its own books burn. It was the symbolic funeral of 8 centuries of learning. It also revealed a sharp contrast in the history of civilizations. The Muslims of Al-Andalus had not built their civilization by burning libraries, yet the people who conquered these lands forced religious conversion and burned books. History remembers both actions. Even today, many people do not realize that Europe also passed through dark periods like these, and that some of their effects can still be seen. Those who do not know history cannot truly understand the future. So let's continue, because this was only the beginning. An even darker chapter was about to begin, a time when even people's hearts and beliefs would be watched by the state. Imagine this for a moment. Your neighbor is watching you. They notice when you wash, what you eat, how you bury your dead. Then they report everything to a court that could sentence you to death. This was the reality of being a Morisco. The Spanish Inquisition created one of the most organized systems of surveillance in history. Its goal was simple: to find out whether the people who were Christians on paper were still Muslims in their hearts. So how did they decide? Small details could become a matter of life and death. If a woman went to the river several times a day to wash, it could be seen as making wudu. If a gardener washed his arms during work, he became suspicious. If a family wrapped their dead in a clean kafan, it could be used as evidence against them. One case from 1577 shows just how far this suspicion went. A young woman heard that the Ottoman fleet had been defeated at the Battle of Lepanto. She quietly told a friend in Arabic, "This year has been bad for us." That single sentence was enough to make her a target of the Inquisition. Another example was Miguel Cañete, a gardener. In 1606, he was accused simply because he had been seen washing his arms and head during work. He was arrested and tortured. The punishments were severe: torture, years in prison, the loss of property, and sometimes public executions known as auto da fe, where people were burned alive. One of the cruelest rules was this: if one member of a family was found guilty, the rest of the family automatically became suspects. The authorities believed that a child could not fall into heresy without learning it from the family, so one accusation could destroy an entire household. To survive, the Moriscos found creative ways to protect their faith. They created hidden places of worship inside ordinary houses. From the outside, they looked completely normal. Inside, people secretly prayed. They also sent secret letters to Muslim scholars in North Africa, asking how they should practice Islam under such harsh conditions. but the Catholic authorities never stopped fearing them. One question always remained. What if the Moriscos became powerful again? What if they joined forces with the Ottoman Empire or the Muslim states of North Africa? That fear would eventually lead to the final decision. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of this system was not only what it did to the Moriscos, it also destroyed trust within society itself. A government that constantly watched its own neighbors, workers and citizens slowly weakened the society from within, because once trust is broken like that, it is very difficult to rebuild. The year was 1609. Now we have returned to where our story began. The Spanish government was searching for a final solution to what they called the Morisco problem. Several ideas were discussed: mass execution, abandoning them at sea, or sending them to work in the mines of South America. In the end, they chose mass expulsion. King Philip III asked the Vatican for approval. At first, Pope Paul V hesitated. The Roman Inquisition believed the Moriscos should continue to be converted through teaching and persuasion, but the Spanish delegation insisted. On April 23, 1609, the expulsion was officially announced. The timing was not a coincidence. The Ottoman Empire was busy fighting the Safavids and dealing with internal revolts. The Muslim states of North Africa had their own problems. No outside Muslim power was in a position to protect the Moriscos. The official order was written in respectful language. It promised that people would not be mistreated. It promised that their property would be protected. The reality was very different. The road to San Mateo in Valencia became filled with the bodies of murdered Moriscos. Some ship captains took their money and then threw their passengers into the sea. Those who reached France were turned away because they were accused of bringing disease. Many became victims of bandits. Around 3 million people, although estimates vary and some sources suggest even more, were driven from the lands where their families had lived for nearly 9 centuries. The people who had once built one of the brightest civilizations in the world had now disappeared from Spain. So what remains today from that 800-year legacy? The Alhambra still stands, one of the most visited monuments in the world. The great Mosque of Cordoba is now a cathedral, but its arches still whisper the greatness of that age. Even the words we use today, algorithm, alcohol, guitar, carry traces of that civilization. And perhaps most importantly, history still remembers that for 8 centuries, 3 different religions were able to live side by side on the same land. Al-Andalus leaves us with both hope and a warning. It shows how tolerance can help build a brilliant civilization. And it reminds us how much can be lost when that tolerance disappears. The story of 8 centuries ends here, but its memory has never truly disappeared.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. My name is Idris Birtan and I am the owner of Religious Story TV. As a Muslim living the Ahir Zaman, I was struggling in my life. My Islamic motivation and discipline were not strong enough, but I realized something. When I watched Islamic videos every day, Salah became easier for me. And avoiding sins became easier too. That's why I decided to start a channel to help other Muslim brothers and sisters. So my wife and I start an early English Islamic channel using AI technology. In the beginning, people were not used to this concept and AI was not producing high quality result either. We also new to both this technology and YouTube. Yes, we had some background. I'm a computer engineer. I also had experience in music and my wife was talent in art and design. But this field was still very new to us. We worked day and night. We researched constantly. To be honest, it was very difficult to keep this channel alive in the beginning. I had lost my job, we had almost no income, and during the first year, we earned almost nothing from this channel. But somehow, we continued. And Allah made this channel become one of the biggest Islamic channels today. Alhamdulillah. But today, we are struggling again in a different way. We are struggling to reach new people. Even though we mention in almost every video, when we don't receive enough likes, comments, and engagement, the channel stops growing. If you want this channel to continue, please support us with your likes and your comments. And if you are not subscribed yet, please subscribe now. We try to read all of your comments, and even if we can't reply all of them, every single one is valuable to us. We constantly make dua for the people on this channel and for Muslims all around the world. Inshallah, we will continue working with your support and of course Allah's help. We continue praying that Allah use us in His dawah. Whether you are watching this video alone or together with your loved ones, I sincerely send my salam to all of you. With love, Assalamu alaikum.